another might be more collectivist, where there's lots and lots of collaboration, and you can only do well if everybody else is doing well. So, there's a bit more collaboration in that. So culture is phenomenal in that respect. One of the other things we talked about recently as well was the element of culture and linguistic background. How do you think that's changing the dynamic in the way that we handle behavior? Does that make a difference?
It does make a difference, particularly in my school, because I'd say 95% of my class come from other countries. Their parents are immigrants from overseas, or they've just grown up in a culturally different environment as well. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. I know you've got a lot of interest in that area as well. Could you talk about your interests in that as well?
It's good that you come from a very multicultural background in terms of maybe yourself, but also in terms of your classroom as well. I sometimes think that the classroom is a bit of a village. So, it's where we enact behaviors and where we collaborate and interact with one another that is reminiscent of what the student is doing at home. So certain cultures might advocate for very individualistic behaviors where there's a lot of value placed on education and the way in which a student interacts with one another. And another might be more collectivist, where there's lots and lots of collaboration, and you can only do well if everybody else is doing well. So, there's a bit more collaboration in that. So culture is phenomenal in that respect, because we can't see the student in a vacuum. So I'm South African. A lot of what I do is, and I think, is in regard to race, because I grew up in a culture where race was a factor. So when I come into the classroom, if I was a learner, the teacher would have to become aware of that about me, that as a learner, this is a focus point. And the teachers probably will need to do that. Have you found that in your own context as well?
Yeah, because my mother is from China, my dad is from here, and I feel like a lot of the times people don't notice that about myself unless I am, telling somebody. How would you give advice to graduate teachers who are about to enter a classroom but they don't? How would they prepare for that, for students that they might not necessarily know where they are all from or the cultural differences? How would you say they should prepare, like, in their mindset?
I think it's essential for a teacher, graduate or not, to know their students well. I mean, it's the first standard, the first AITSL standard. Know your students and how they learn. So I think that knowing comes from asking questions. I mean, how else do we know? If there's something that's unknown to us, we ask questions and we learn through that information that's provided. I think in terms of culture and race and language, especially if there's a different language being spoken at home, and the child is coming in with that other language into the classroom as well, there is an essential reason to get to know the child in that context. So you could do it through maybe a questionnaire or an interview with mom and dad. And nowadays with COVID having changed the way that we do things, we do lots and lots of electronic interviews nowadays. If I have a challenge with a student, I'm arranging a Zoom meeting. It can last maybe 10 minutes, but it's there's an interaction with the other person. I know exactly what they're thinking because, we've had a face-to-face conversation. So I think it's a good idea to perhaps have some of those pre-teaching conversations, either with a student or with a member of the family. It could be, it could be that a student who comes from from a background other than English might find that their parents might be reluctant to communicate in English because there might be a few drawbacks. Their languages are just as rich, remember. So, they are bringing that richness into the classroom as well. And by showing value for that, the teacher's respecting something that's outside the mainstream norm, So it's like you were saying, you've got to tell someone, that, you've got parents from two different cultural groups, but at the same time, that's enriched your life. You've got two very rich cultures that have contributed to who you are. So we have to value that. We've got to celebrate where the student comes from and bring that into the classroom so that the teacher celebrates it in the classroom, not reductively seeing it as being different, which is some of the ways we might have done in the past, where we say this group is from Africa, or this child is from South Africa. In the case of me, I was educated in South Africa, so it was fine, I was there in the same country anyway. But I think by drawing attention to the way in which we celebrate things and diversity is celebrated, it's probably going to be excellent for the student, because then they are valued in that context as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel that way as well with my students. I try my best to know, because of my own experience, I try my best to understand what their cultural backgrounds are and what their beliefs are, what celebrations they might celebrate as well. A simple way I do it in my classroom is I've made like a little poster that's got how to say like a hello or a greeting in so many different languages, and I made sure to include the languages of the students in that poster as well. So there's like an Indian language that one of my students speak. I'm gonna butcher the name of the language. I think it's Gujarati or something.
Gujarati.
Yeah. And I'd never heard of it before this year. But she told me the name of the language. I'm like, oh, cool. How do you say? What's the greeting in your language? And she says, oh, I usually say Kimcho. So I'll say, okay, cool. We can say that in the morning if you want to. So usually in the morning I'll say, good morning, so-and-so, and they'll respond to me in a greeting of their choice. Sometimes it's just in English, sometimes it's just good morning, Miss Dempsey. Sometimes it's just a hello or a greeting in their own language, or they'll choose a greeting in another language because I've got a poster up in the classroom. So, sometimes they'll say like Ohayo, which is in Japanese, or they'll say, I've got a boy in my class who's Korean, and he'll say Annyeong, so we'll say Annyeong, and then other kids will, they'll say, oh, he's doing it, I want to do that one too this morning. So it's kind of fun, like they get to, promote their own culture, but also be like, oh, I kind of get them to be interested about other cultures as well. And, greeting is just a small little thing to greet others in the classroom with their cultural languages.
I think you're doing amazing work though, Kate. That is so good to hear, because not only are you celebrating, you're valuing, because other students, they like what they hear, like you said, and then they're going to practice some of that. So, they're not just celebrating their own cultures, but then they are celebrating somebody else's as well. So the valuing of every single student, their full identity is their culture and their language and their background. And when they bring that into the classroom, that's wonderful. So you're doing really good work. Really, really good.